On February 24, 2022, the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine, sending in tens of thousands of troops that marched towards Kiev, attempting to overthrow the Ukrainian government. In the early days, it seems as though Moscow would steamroll over the Ukrainian military, swiftly taking over the country the same way it quickly annexed Crimea in 2014. But what followed was something completely different. Ukraine, equipped with American and European weapons, was actually capable of pushing back the Russians and regaining a large chunk of Russian-occupied eastern Ukraine. The subsequent military maneuvers that brought the Russians where they are today are well understood. What is less well known is that Moscow and Kiev almost finalized the peace treaty only a month after the Russians initiated their so-called special military operation. So what happened? Why was the treaty never finalized? In this video, we'll look into the Istanbul Communiqué, the Russo-Ukrainian peace treaty that could have saved tens of thousands of lives. Let's start the video. In the early days of the war, after the shock that came with Russia's invasion wore off, it seemed as though the Russian war machine wasn't as dominant as the world expected it to be. Putin expected to steamroll over the Ukrainians and claim a quick victory, but only days after the invasion, it was clear that the Russian military was falling apart. A massive traffic jam halted the invasion from the north, and the Russians were meeting heavy resistance from the east. Zelensky understood that Russia's poor performance meant that Moscow could be more inclined to consider a peaceful exit. The Ukrainians seized this opportunity and requested a personal meeting between Volodymyr Zelensky and Vladimir Putin in order to find a way out of the crisis before it spiraled out of control. But Putin refused to meet Zelensky. Instead, he appointed a team of negotiators and requested that Belarusian President Lukashenko host the talks and personally act as a mediator. And so, the peace negotiations commenced on February 28, 2022, only 4 days after the start of the war. The Ukrainian delegation was headed by David Arachamia, the parliamentary leader of Zelensky's political party and one of his top advisors. The delegation included Defense Minister Oleksiy Reznikov and Presidential Advisor Mikhailo Podolyak and other senior officials. The Russian delegation was led by Vladimir Medinsky, a senior advisor to the Russian president, who had previously served as the culture minister. The delegation further included the deputy ministers of defense and foreign affairs, together with other officials. At the first meeting, the Russians laid out a set of unrealistic conditions, effectively demanding the unconditional surrender of Ukraine, which for obvious reasons was a tough pill to swallow for the Ukrainians. But very quickly, as Russia's battlefield reality started sinking in, Moscow started shifting its position. By March 7th, early drafts of a proto-communique were already circulating. The parties were now negotiating about a post-war order. Russia demanded absolute neutrality, while Ukraine prioritized the security guarantees that it hoped to receive from its allies. Around 2 weeks after the start of the war, the Russian and Ukrainian foreign ministers met in Antalya, Turkey. After their meeting ended, they appeared to be optimistic about the future of their talks. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba spoke of a systematic and sustainable solution for the Ukrainians, and that Ukraine was ready to discuss guarantees it hoped to receive from NATO member states and Russia. Ukraine seemed to be preferring a multilateral peace agreement whereby its NATO allies and other countries, including Russia, would guarantee to come to Ukraine's aid if it was ever attacked by a foreign power. It needed ironclad security guarantees, since the vague security assurances that it received through the Budapest Memorandum of 1994 were completely thrown out of the window when the Russians invaded Crimea in 2014. You see, when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991, multiple Soviet successor states inherited parts of the Soviet nuclear arsenal. Although Russia still had operational control over the weapons, since only Moscow had the codes needed to detonate the weapons. Belarus and Kazakhstan quickly transferred their nukes to Russia, while Ukraine took some time to internally debate its next steps. The Ukrainian leadership at the time recognized the usefulness of the weapons in deterring potential adversaries. It even debated manually changing the detonation mechanism in order to gain full access to the weapons. After 3 years of internally debating its options and negotiating with the Americans and the Russians, Ukraine eventually signed the Budapest Memorandum. It agreed to voluntarily give up its nuclear weapons in return for security assurances from the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, China, and France. It's important to understand that security assurances are not the same as security guarantees. The signatories were not obliged to come to Ukraine's rescue in any way. They only assured Ukraine that they would consider doing so when push comes to shove. That's why Russia was able to invade Ukraine in 2014 without worrying about the consequences. This time around, Ukraine wouldn't settle for anything less than solid security guarantees. On March 14, 2022, while the Russian and Ukrainian delegations were meeting via Zoom, Zelensky posted a message on his Telegram channel calling for normal, effective security guarantees that would not be like the Budapest ones. The negotiations appeared to be heading in the right direction. By the end of March, it was clear that Russia's attempt to take Kyiv, Chernihiv, Kharkiv and Sumy failed spectacularly, forcing the Russians to view the peace negotiations as a way out. 5 weeks after the start of the war, Ukrainian and Russian officials in Antalya announced a breakthrough with the so-called Istanbul Communique, which would form the basis of a future peace treaty. Ukraine would be a permanently neutral non-nuclear state. It would renounce all intentions to join any military alliance, and it would never allow any foreign military troops or bases on its soil. The communique listed the permanent members of the UN Security Council as Ukraine's future security guarantors, together with Canada, Germany, Israel, Italy, Poland and Turkey. They would be all obliged to come to Ukraine's aid if it were ever to be invaded by a foreign power. I personally think that could have been a great solution to the conflict, since both parties would have gained a lot from it. Russia would gain a neutral neighbor that wouldn't join NATO, which would give the Russians the defensive buffer zone that they desired. David Arachamia, Zelensky's top advisor, whom I mentioned earlier, confirmed this view when he stated that, quote, "The war could have ended in the spring of 2022 if Ukraine had agreed to neutrality," unquote. And, quote, "Russia's goal was to put pressure on us so that we could be neutral. This was the main thing for them. They were ready to end the war if we accepted neutrality, like Finland once did. And for us to make a commitment that we will not join NATO. This was the main thing," unquote. This would have saved tens of thousands of deaths and the displacement of millions of Ukrainians. But the treaty was never finalized, since the United States saw a chance to defeat the Russians in Ukraine. You see, by the time the breakthrough was announced by the Russian and Ukrainian delegations in Antalya in March 29th, less than 6 weeks after the Russian invasion, it was clear that Russia's offensive capabilities were not what the Americans expected. The Russian military turned out to be much weaker than expected. So weak in fact that it looked like Ukraine, with only 1/5 of Russia's population, was able to inflict heavy casualties on the Russians, pushing them back from the positions they initially occupied. The US abandoned the peace negotiations early on, and instead favored supplying Ukraine with all the weapons it needed to defeat the Russians, hoping that the Putin regime would lose power if the war it started turned out to be a huge mistake. This would have been a great deal for the United States. It would defeat its main adversary in Europe without having to risk any of its troops. It would have been foolish not to take that deal when it looked like Russia could be easily beaten. As Leon Panetta, the director of the CIA under President Barack Obama, explained in March 22, the conflict is, quote, "a proxy war with Russia, whether we say it or not," unquote. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin at a press conference in Poland in late April of the same year stated that, quote, "We want to see Russia weakened to the degree that it can't do the things that it has done in invading Ukraine," unquote. America's position at the time was clear. It would be foolish not to seize this opportunity. Who knows if America would be presented with such an opportunity ever again. With that in mind, Boris Johnson, on behalf of the Western Bloc, flew to Kyiv unannounced to deliver the message to Zelensky personally. According to The Nation, which quoted Arachamia, Boris Johnson arrived in Kyiv on April 6, 2022, with only 2 messages. Quote, "The first was that Putin was a criminal. He should be pressured, not negotiated with. And the second is that even if Ukraine is ready to sign some agreement on guarantees with Putin, they, the NATO powers, are not," unquote. Zelensky simply didn't get the backing he needed to sign the treaty. And this is not what I'm saying, this is what one of Zelensky's top advisors said. He was there during the meeting between Zelensky and Boris Johnson, and this doesn't surprise me in any way. Ukraine was a golden opportunity for Russia's enemies, who wanted to weaken it once and for all without having to risk more than military aid. America gambled on a Ukrainian victory, but now that Russia has the upper hand, it looks like the gamble will not pay off. Ukraine is unlikely to get the same conditions during future peace negotiations when its bargaining power has vastly diminished, considering its current weakness on the battlefield. But who knows how the war may develop in the future? Only time will tell. I would love to know whether you agree with my analysis. Share your view in the comment section. Like the video in order to nudge the YouTube algorithm in the right direction, and I'll see you in the next video.